The sun blazed mercilessly over the vast expanse of the American frontier, turning the red dust into swirling devils that danced across the barren plains. It was the summer of 1880, and the Texas borderlands stretched endlessly beneath a sky so bright it hurt to look upon. Heat waves shimmered like liquid glass, distorting the distant mesas until they appeared to float above the earth like mirages of ancient ships. Margaret Sullivan pressed her back against the rough wooden wall of her late husband's ranch house, trying to make herself invisible as voices carried from the parlor. Her hands, work-worn and trembling, clutched the thin fabric of her dress, one of only 3 she owned, each patched and repatched until the original material was barely recognizable. "She's eating us out of house and home," her brother-in-law, Thomas, growled. His voice carried the same cruel edge that had become all too familiar since her husband's death 6 months prior. A widow with no children, no prospects, and a figure that— He paused, and Margaret could hear the sneer in his voice. "Well, let's just say she ain't the delicate flower most men around here are looking for." Margaret's eyes stung, but she refused to let the tears fall. She'd learned long ago that tears only invited more cruelty. Her body, fuller and rounder than what was considered fashionable or desirable in these parts, had been a source of her late husband's rage. Samuel Sullivan had been a man of particular tastes, and when Margaret hadn't matched the slim, willowy brides he'd seen in the newspapers from back east, he'd made his disappointment known with his fists. Mitchell's offered a solution. Thomas continued, and Margaret's blood ran cold at the mention of that name. Josiah Mitchell owned the largest cattle ranch in 3 counties and was known for his brutal treatment of anyone who crossed him. "He's willing to take her off our hands. Says he needs a woman to manage his household, and he ain't particular about her looks." "How much?" This came from Thomas's wife, Sarah, her voice sharp with interest. "Enough to cover our debts and then some. Lord knows we need it after the drought killed half our herd." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. They were discussing her like livestock at auction, putting a price on her life as if she were nothing more than property to be bartered. The humiliation burned through her like acid, but beneath it, something else stirred. A fierce, desperate determination to survive. Through the thin walls, she heard Sarah's response. "When does he want her?" "Tomorrow morning. He's sending his men at dawn." The finality in those words sent Margaret into motion. She slipped away from the wall, moving with the quiet grace she'd perfected during years of trying not to wake Samuel when he'd been drinking. In the small room that had been hers, a converted storage space barely large enough for a narrow cot, she gathered her meager possessions. 2 dresses, a hairbrush with half its bristles missing, a small leather pouch containing her mother's wedding ring, the only thing of value she'd managed to hide from Samuel's gambling. Her fingers lingered on a faded photograph, the edges worn soft from handling. It showed her on her wedding day, young and hopeful, not yet understanding what kind of man she'd married. She'd been 19 then, orphaned and desperate for security. Now, at 24, she was wiser but no less desperate. As darkness fell across the plains, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange, Margaret made her preparations. She knew the land around the ranch well enough, had spent countless hours walking its boundaries during the times when Samuel's temper made the house unbearable. There was a trail that led north, toward the territories. It would be dangerous for a woman alone, but staying meant a fate worse than death. She waited until the house grew quiet, until Thomas's snoring echoed through the thin walls, and the last lamp was extinguished. The desert night had turned cold, as it always did, and Margaret pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. She eased open the back door, wincing at every creak of the hinges. The moon hung low and full, casting long shadows across the dusty yard. In the distance, a coyote howled, its mournful cry answered by another, then another, until the night filled with their wild chorus. Margaret's heart pounded so hard she feared it might wake the household. But she forced herself to move, one careful step at a time. She made it to the stable without incident. The horses shifted restlessly in their stalls, but she dared not take one. Horse theft was a hanging offense, and Thomas would surely come after her with the law on his side. Instead, she filled a canteen from the water barrel and took what food she could find in the tack room: hardtack biscuits and dried beef, meant for the ranch hands' trail rides. As she slipped out of the stable, a figure emerged from the shadows. Margaret's heart stopped, her body freezing in terror. Going somewhere. Margaret? It was Jake, one of the ranch hands, a young man who'd always been kind to her. His eyes took in her bundle of possessions, the canteen, the desperate look on her face. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I have to go. They're going to—" "I know." Jake's face was grim. "Heard them talking earlier. Mitchell's a devil. Margaret, you're right to run." He pressed something into her hand. A small compass. "Head north toward Devil's Canyon. There's water there, and caves where you can hide. After that," he shrugged, "after that, it's in God's hands." "Why are you helping me?" Jake's eyes were sad. "My sister wasn't much younger than you when Mitchell took a fancy to her. We found her body 3 months later." He stepped aside, clearing her path. "Go now, before someone else wakes. And Margaret, don't look back." Margaret squeezed his hand in wordless gratitude, then fled into the night. The desert stretched before her, vast and unforgiving. But she welcomed its dangers over what waited for her at the ranch. Her boots, worn thin from years of use, offered little protection against the rocky ground. But she pressed on, driven by fear and determination. Behind her, the ranch grew smaller, its lights fading until they were nothing more than pinpricks in the darkness. The coyotes continued their haunting songs, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out its warning. The night air was sharp with the scent of sage and dust, and Margaret breathed it in deeply. Tasting freedom for the first time in years, she knew the odds were against her. A woman alone in the desert, with little water and less food, pursued by men who knew the land far better than she did. But as she walked, something shifted inside her. The shame and humiliation that had weighted her steps for so long began to fall away, replaced by something fiercer. They had tried to sell her like cattle, had deemed her worthless except as property to be traded for their debts. Her own body, the source of so much pain and rejection, now carried her away from that life. Each step was an act of rebellion, each breath a declaration of her worth. The desert wind picked up, sending dust devils spinning across her path. Margaret pulled her shawl over her nose and mouth, squinting against the grit. She thought of her mother, dead these 5 years, who had always told her she was strong. "You got pioneer blood in you, Maggie," she'd said. "Women like us, we survive." As the first pale light of dawn began to streak the eastern sky, Margaret looked back one last time. Somewhere behind her, Thomas would be discovering her empty room. Mitchell's men would arrive to find their prize gone. The hunt would begin soon. But for now, in this moment between night and day, Margaret Sullivan was free, scared, exhausted, and facing an uncertain future. But free. And as she turned her face toward the rising sun and the unknown territories beyond, she made a promise to herself. Whatever came next, she would never again allow herself to be bought or sold. The desert stretched endlessly before her, hostile and beautiful in equal measure, and Margaret walked on, leaving her old life behind in the dust, carrying nothing but hope and the fierce determination to write her own destiny. The sun had climbed to its merciless zenith when Margaret's legs finally gave out. She collapsed beside a towering saguaro cactus, its arms reaching skyward like a surrendering soldier. Her water had run out hours ago, and her tongue felt like leather against the roof of her mouth. The landscape around her was a maze of rocky outcroppings and thorny vegetation, beautiful in its harsh way but utterly unforgiving to the unprepared traveler. She had walked through the night and into the scorching day, putting as much distance as possible between herself and the Sullivan Ranch. But now, with the sun beating down and her strength depleted, Margaret wondered if she had merely traded one form of death for another. The irony wasn't lost on her, escaping being sold to a brutal man only to perish in the desert like a foolish tenderfoot. A shadow fell across her face, and Margaret's eyes fluttered open. She hadn't realized she'd closed them. Above her stood a horse, and atop it, a man whose silhouette blocked out the burning sun. For a terrifying moment, she thought Mitchell's men had found her. Her body tensed, ready to run despite having no strength left. "Easy there," a deep voice rumbled, surprisingly gentle. "I ain't here to hurt you." The man dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent more time in the saddle than on foot. As he moved out of the sun's direct path, Margaret got her first clear look at him. He was tall and lean, with the weathered look of a man who'd seen too much of life's harder edges. A scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, silver against sun-darkened skin. His eyes were the color of winter sky, pale blue and distant, holding depths of something Margaret couldn't quite name. He crouched beside her, moving slowly as if approaching a spooked animal. "Name's Ethan Cross," he said, unhooking a canteen from his belt. "You look like you could use some water." Margaret's pride warred with her desperate thirst. She'd learned to be wary of kindness from men. It usually came with a price, but survival won out, and she accepted the canteen with trembling hands. "Slowly," Ethan warned as she began to gulp. "Too much too fast and you'll make yourself sick." The water was warm, but tasted like salvation. Margaret forced herself to take small sips, feeling life seep back into her parched body. As she drank, she studied the man who'd appeared like some unlikely guardian angel. He wore the typical attire of a drifting cowboy, worn leather chaps, a shirt that had seen better days, and a hat that had weathered many storms. But there was something different about him, something in the way he held himself that spoke of military bearing. The way his hand never strayed far from the Colt at his hip suggested a man always ready for trouble. "Thank you," Margaret managed when she finally lowered the canteen. Ethan nodded, his eyes taking in her bedraggled state, the torn hem of her dress, the dust caking her face, the desperation poorly hidden behind attempted dignity. "You running from something or towards something? Does it matter?" "Suppose not." He sat back on his heels, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "Desert's full of folks running one way or another. Question is whether what's chasing you is worse than what's ahead." Margaret thought of Mitchell's cruel reputation, of being sold like property, of a life that would be no life at all. "Nothing could be worse than what's behind me." Ethan studied her for a long moment, and Margaret had the unsettling feeling he could see straight through to her soul. "Are you traveling alone?" She hesitated, then nodded. There was no point in lying. Her solitary state was obvious. "That's either very brave or very foolish." "Desperate," Margaret corrected. "I'm desperate." Something shifted in Ethan's expression, a flicker of recognition, perhaps, or understanding. He stood, dusting off his pants. "Well, desperate or not, you won't last another hour out here without proper shelter. There's a water hole about 2 miles north. I was heading there myself." Margaret struggled to her feet, swaying slightly. Pride made her want to refuse his help, but practicality won out. "I don't have any money to pay you for your kindness." "Didn't ask for any." Ethan moved to his horse, a beautiful paint mare who regarded Margaret with intelligent eyes. "Question is, can you ride?" "I can manage." He helped her mount, his hands impersonal but steady at her waist. Margaret was acutely aware of her fuller figure, the way her dress pulled tight as she settled in the saddle. She waited for the familiar look of disgust or disappointment, but Ethan's expression remained neutral. He swung up behind her, reaching around to take the reins. The closeness was unavoidable, and Margaret tensed at the contact. It had been years since a man's proximity hadn't meant pain or humiliation. "Relax," Ethan said quietly. "Belle here's got a smooth gait, but you'll wear yourself out sitting rigid like that." They rode in silence for a while. The only sounds the steady clop of hooves and the whisper of wind through the cacti. Margaret found herself relaxing despite her better judgment. Exhaustion overcoming wariness. "You got a name?" Ethan asked eventually. "Margaret." She hesitated, then decided there was no harm in honesty. "Margaret Sullivan. Widow Sullivan, I suppose. Sorry for your loss. Margaret almost laughed at that. Sorry? She'd felt many things when Samuel died, relief foremost among them, but sorrow hadn't been one. It was 6 months ago, she said simply. Recent enough. There was something in his tone that suggested he understood more than she'd said. Where were you hoping to reach? North, anywhere north. She felt him shift slightly behind her. North's a big place. You got people there? No. The admission hurt more than she'd expected. I don't have people anywhere. They crested a rise, and below them, Margaret saw what looked like a small oasis. A cluster of cottonwood trees surrounded a natural spring, their leaves rustling with promise of water and shade. There, Ethan said. We'll rest there a spell. Let Belle drink her fill. As they descended toward the waterhole, Margaret noticed signs of an old campsite, a fire ring built with stones, logs arranged as crude seating. This was clearly a known spot for travelers. Ethan helped her dismount, and Margaret's legs nearly buckled. He steadied her with a hand at her elbow, the touch brief and businesslike. Sit, he instructed, guiding her to one of the logs. I'll see about some food. Margaret watched as he moved with economical efficiency, tending to his horse first, a mark of a true outdoorsman. He pulled supplies from his saddlebags, jerked beef, hardtack, a small bag of dried fruit. It ain't fancy, he said, laying out the simple meal, but it'll keep you going. They ate in companionable silence, Margaret trying not to wolf down the food despite her hunger. The shade of the cottonwoods was blessed relief after the punishing sun, and the sound of water trickling over rocks was almost musical. You know Mitchell's men will be looking for you, Ethan said suddenly. Margaret's head snapped up, heart racing. How did you? Past them about 5 miles back. They were asking after a woman matching your description. He took a slow drink from his canteen. Seemed mighty eager to find you. Fear clawed at Margaret's throat. Did you tell them anything? Told them I'd seen a woman heading east toward Lonesome Creek. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. They didn't strike me as the sort of men I'd want to help. Why? The word came out as barely a whisper. Why would you lie for me? You don't know me, don't know what I've done. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something distant. When he spoke, his voice carried weight of old pain. Had a wife once, Sarah, sweetest woman God ever made. When the war came, I went to fight, left her with my brother for protection. His jaw tightened. Came back to find she'd been sold to settle his gambling debts. By the time I tracked her down, he didn't finish, but he didn't need to. The scar on his face, the shadows in his eyes, the way his hand unconsciously moved to a locket hanging inside his shirt. They told the story well enough. I'm sorry, Margaret said, meaning it. Was a long time ago, but the pain in his voice suggested otherwise. Point is, I know what men like Mitchell do to women they think they own. Won't be party to it. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and red. Ethan stood, dusting off his pants. We should move on. This place is too well known. Mitchell's men might circle back when they don't find you at Lonesome Creek. We? Margaret asked, surprised. He gave her a measured look. You planning to make it north on foot with no supplies and those men hunting you? I can't ask you to. You didn't ask. He began packing up their meal. I'm offering, got business in Fort Defiance myself. You're welcome to ride along that far. After that, he shrugged. After that, you can decide your own path. Margaret studied him, this scarred stranger who'd appeared when she needed help most. Trust didn't come easily, not after Samuel, not after being bartered like goods. But something in Ethan's eyes, that deep, abiding sadness that spoke of understanding, made her decision. All right, she said. Fort Defiance. As they prepared to leave, Ethan handed her a spare hat from his saddlebags. Sun'll kill you faster than any man out here. Best keep covered. The hat was too large, but Margaret pulled it on gratefully, as Ethan helped her mount Belle again. His hands were careful, respectful, so different from what she'd known. They rode out as the shadows grew long, Two damaged souls heading north through a landscape that cared nothing for human troubles. Behind them, somewhere in the vast desert, angry men searched for a woman who dared to claim her freedom. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the unknown. But for the first time in years, Margaret felt something she'd thought lost forever. Hope. It was as fragile as a desert flower, as precious as water in this harsh land. And like the man who rode with her, marked by scars but still standing, she began to believe that survival, real survival, not just existing, might be possible after all. The storm hit without warning on their third day together. One moment the sky was clear. The next, a wall of red dust rose from the earth like the wrath of God himself. Ethan had seen it coming. Something in the way the horses grew restless, the sudden stillness of the desert air. "Sandstorm!" he shouted over the rising wind, pulling his bandana up over his nose and mouth. "We need shelter now." Margaret pressed herself against Belle's neck as the first blast of sand hit them. The world disappeared into a howling red chaos that stung exposed skin and turned breathing into a battle. Ethan guided Belle with sure hands, leading them toward a cluster of rocks he'd spotted earlier. They found a shallow cave barely large enough for the three of them. Ethan pushed Margaret inside first, then brought Belle as far into the shelter as the mare would fit. The storm raged outside their meager protection, sand swirling in miniature cyclones at the cave's entrance. "Here." Ethan pulled a spare shirt from his saddlebag, tearing it into strips. He handed one to Margaret. "Tie this over your nose and mouth. It'll help with the dust." Their fingers brushed as she took the cloth, and Margaret was struck by how gentle his hands were despite their calluses and scars. They sat pressed against the cave wall, Belle's body blocking the worst of the storm's fury. The forced proximity should have frightened her. A strange man. A confined space. Nowhere to run. But Ethan kept himself carefully distant, respecting the inches between them like a sacred boundary. "How long will it last?" Margaret asked, her voice muffled by the makeshift mask. "Could be hours. These summer storms are unpredictable." He checked on Belle, running a soothing hand down her neck. "We were lucky to find shelter." Lucky. Margaret wondered if that's what this was. 3 days since Ethan had found her dying in the desert. 3 days of traveling together through some of the harshest land God ever made. And in those 3 days, she'd learned more about kindness from this scarred stranger than in 5 years of marriage. The storm's howl intensified, and Belle whinnied nervously. Ethan spoke to her in low, calming tones. The same voice he used when Margaret woke from nightmares she wouldn't discuss. She watched him in the dim light. This man who asked for nothing, who shared his meager supplies without complaint, who kept watch while she slept. "Why Fort Defiance?" she asked, needing conversation to drown out the storm's violence. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Got word my brother might be there. Haven't seen him since." He touched his scar unconsciously. "Since I came back from the war and found Sarah gone." "The brother who—" Margaret stopped, realizing the weight of what she was asking. "The same." His voice held no anger, only a deep weariness. "James was always weak when it came to cards and whiskey. I don't blame him anymore. Blame doesn't bring the dead back." They sat in silence then, each lost in their own ghosts. The storm continued its assault, and Margaret found herself thinking about the strange turns life took. A week ago, she'd been a prisoner in all but name, waiting to be sold. Now she sat in a cave with a man who'd lost everything to the same kind of cruelty, finding shelter from more than just the sandstorm. Hours passed before the wind finally began to die. When they emerged, the landscape had changed. Dunes shifted and reformed by the storm's fury. The setting sun painted the new topography in shades of amber and rose. "We'll need to be careful," Ethan said, studying the altered terrain. "Storms like that can cover a trail completely. Easy to get lost." As if to emphasize his point, the distant sound of horses reached them. Ethan's hand went immediately to his gun. Pushing Margaret behind him, through the settling dust, riders appeared. 5 men, moving with the purposeful pace of hunters on a scent. "Mitchell's men," Margaret breathed, Recognizing the lead rider's distinctive black hat, Ethan pulled her deeper into the rocks. "Stay quiet. They haven't spotted us yet." The riders passed within 50 yards of their position. Margaret could hear their voices carrying on the wind. Storm wiped out the tracks. One man complained, "Could be anywhere by now. Mitchell wants her found." The leader replied, "Doesn't care if we have to turn over every rock from here to Mexico. Nobody makes a fool of him." "Awful lot of trouble for one woman," another muttered. The leader wheeled his horse around so fast the animal reared. "You questioning Mr. Mitchell's orders?" "No, sir, just saying." "Then shut your mouth and keep searching. She's out here somewhere, and probably not alone. No woman could survive this long in the desert by herself." They rode on, their figures disappearing into the gathering dusk. Margaret realized she'd been holding her breath and released it shakily. "They'll be back," Ethan said grimly. "Men like that don't give up easy." That night, they made a cold camp, not daring to risk a fire that might draw attention. They shared water and dried meat in the darkness, sitting closer than usual for warmth as the desert temperature plummeted. "I'm putting you in danger," Margaret said quietly. "You should leave me at the next settlement. You can what?" His voice was gentle but firm. "Walk into Fort Defiance alone with Mitchell's men on your trail. They'll have you before you can blink." "This isn't your fight." "Maybe not." He was silent for a moment. "But I've run from too many fights already. Lost too much by not standing ground when it mattered." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. When was the last time someone had stood up for her? Protected her without demanding payment in flesh or servitude? "I don't know how to repay." "I don't want repayment." His voice turned rough. "Just want to see you safe." Is that so hard to believe? It was, actually. In Margaret's experience, men's kindness always came with expectations. But Ethan had proven different at every turn. When she'd stumbled from exhaustion, he'd steadied her without lingering touches. When they'd shared Belle's saddle, he'd kept his hands carefully neutral on the reins. When she'd cried out in her sleep, he'd woken her with words, not contact. "Tell me about Sarah," she said softly, "if you want to." In the darkness, she heard him shift. She had hair like spun gold, always smelled like lavender, even out here where nothing sweet grows. Could sing like an angel and had a temper like the devil when riled. A soft, sad laugh. She was tiny, barely came up to my shoulder, but she had more courage than 10 men. When I left for the war, she promised to wait, and she did. It was me who failed her. "You couldn't have known." "Couldn't I?" Bitterness crept into his voice. "I knew what James was, knew his weaknesses, should have made better arrangements, should have—" He trailed off. Margaret reached out in the darkness, found his hand, and squeezed gently. He went very still at the contact, and she started to pull away, but he turned his palm up, letting their fingers intertwine briefly before releasing her. "She was lucky to have someone who loved her so much," Margaret said. Was she? That love didn't save her in the end. They fell quiet again, each nursing old wounds that the desert night couldn't heal. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, answered by its pack. The sound sent shivers down Margaret's spine. Predators calling to each other in the darkness, just like Mitchell's men. Dawn came too soon, bringing with it fresh dangers. As they prepared to move on, Ethan spotted dust clouds to the south, riders moving fast. "We need to ride hard today," he said. "Helping Margaret mount? If we can reach Devil's Ridge by nightfall, we might lose them in the canyons." The day became a blur of heat and motion. Belle proved her worth, carrying them both without complaint across terrain that shifted from sandy flats to rocky escarpments. Twice they had to dismount and lead her through passages too treacherous to ride. Margaret's dress caught on thorns and rocks, tearing beyond repair, but she hardly noticed. Survival had stripped away concerns about propriety. At midday, they stopped to rest Belle and themselves. As Margaret drank sparingly from their dwindling water supply, she caught Ethan watching her with an unreadable expression. "What is it?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You're stronger than you know," he said simply. Most would have given up by now. I've had practice surviving things that should have broken me. Understanding passed between them. Two people who'd endured different hells but recognized the scars in each other. Ethan reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face with surprising tenderness. The gesture was over in an instant, but it left Margaret feeling more cherished than years of marriage ever had. By late afternoon, Devil's Ridge loomed before them, a maze of red rock canyons and narrow passages. But as they approached the entrance to the canyon system, disaster struck. Belle stumbled, her front leg finding a hidden hole. She went down hard, throwing both riders. Margaret hit the ground with bruising force, the breath knocked from her lungs. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard Belle's agonized whinnying and Ethan's curse. "Her leg," Ethan said, his face grim as he examined the mare. "It's not broken, but she's lame. Can't carry us both anymore." The dust cloud of their pursuers was visible now, maybe 2 miles behind and closing. Margaret struggled to her feet, ignoring the pain in her ribs. "Leave me. Take Belle and go." Ethan looked at her like she'd grown a second head. "Not happening. You can't help me if you're dead." He stood. Decision made. "Then we go on foot, into the canyons where horses will be a disadvantage." He quickly stripped the essential supplies from Belle's saddle. "Can you run?" Margaret nodded, though every part of her body protested. Ethan fashioned a quick lead for Belle, hoping she could at least walk slowly behind them. Then he took Margaret's hand. "Stay close. These canyons are a maze. Easy to get lost, easier to get trapped." They plunged into Devil's Ridge as the sun began its descent, painting the canyon walls in shades of blood and fire. Behind them, the sound of approaching horses grew louder. Margaret's heart pounded as they navigated the twisting passages, Ethan leading with the sureness of a man who'd hidden in these rocks before. "Through here," he directed, guiding them into a narrow crack between two towering walls. They had to turn sideways to fit, Belle struggling but managing to follow. The passage opened into a small hidden canyon with a trickling spring. "Old Apache hideout," Ethan explained, already working to obscure their tracks. "Found it years ago. If we're lucky, they'll pass right by." They waited in tense silence as darkness fell. The sound of horses and men echoed through the canyons, sometimes seeming right on top of them, sometimes distant. Mitchell's men were searching systematically, but the maze of rock confused sounds and directions. "They found the mare's tracks," a voice called out, terrifyingly close. "They went into the canyons." "Split up," ordered the leader. "Check every passage. They're in here somewhere." Margaret pressed herself against the canyon wall, hardly daring to breathe. Beside her, Ethan stood ready, hand on his gun. Belle, exhausted and hurting, stood with her head low, mercifully quiet. Footsteps approached their hiding spot. A shadow fell across the entrance to their sanctuary. Margaret's hand found Ethan's in the darkness, gripping tight. This was it, fight or die. But at the last moment, the searcher turned away. Called by his companions to check another passage, the footsteps receded, the voices grew distant, and finally, blessed silence returned to the canyons. They stayed frozen for another hour before Ethan finally relaxed his vigilance. "They'll camp at the canyon mouth," he whispered. "Wait for daylight to search again. But there's another way out, if you can manage more walking." Margaret nodded, though exhaustion weighed on her like a physical thing. As they prepared for another night journey, she looked at this man who'd risked everything for a stranger. The moon had risen, silvering his scarred face, and she saw not just a protector, but something more, something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "Thank you," she whispered. He met her eyes, and in them she saw a reflection of her own growing feelings, unexpected, inconvenient, but undeniable. "We're not safe yet," he said roughly. But as they moved deeper into the canyons, Belle limping gamely behind them, Margaret felt safer than she had in years. Not from the men hunting them, but from the walls she'd built around her heart. Out here in this desolate beauty, fleeing for their lives, she was finding something she'd thought lost forever, the capacity to trust, maybe even to love. Again. The hidden canyon was a world unto itself, carved from red rock by centuries of wind and rare water. They'd been sheltering there for 2 days now, waiting for Mitchell's men to abandon their search. The small spring provided precious water, and Ethan had managed to trap a rabbit, giving them their first hot meal in days. Night had fallen again, bringing with it the desert's sharp cold. They sat by their small fire, built deep in the canyon where its light couldn't escape to betray them. Belle stood nearby, her injured leg improving but still tender. The moon hung full and bright above the canyon walls, turning everything to silver and shadow. "Tell me about before," Ethan said quietly, feeding another stick to the fire. "Before your husband." Margaret pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Ethan had insisted she take it while he made do with his coat. "Not much to tell. My parents had a small farm in Missouri. Good people. Hard-working. They died when I was 18. Fever took them both within a week of each other. I'm sorry." She shrugged, an old hurt that had scarred over. "Samuel came calling soon after. He seemed kind then, stable. My parents' farm had debts, and he offered to take care of everything. I thought—" She laughed bitterly. "I thought I was lucky, a young widow with nothing, and here was a man willing to marry me and save the farm. But he wasn't kind. No." Margaret stared into the flames, remembering. "The kindness lasted exactly until our wedding night, when he saw that that my figure wasn't what he expected. He made his disappointment clear, said I'd tricked him, letting him court me in winter when heavy coats hid the truth." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, letting her speak. 5 years, Margaret continued. 5 years of being told I was too much, too soft, too round, too everything. He had very specific ideas about what a wife should look like, picked up from those catalog brides in his magazines. Delicate, bird-like women who'd need protecting, not someone like me who could work alongside him, who was sturdy and strong. "His loss," Ethan said softly. Margaret looked up, surprised by the conviction in his voice. "Most men would agree with him, that I'm not desirable. Most men are fools." He met her gaze steadily. "Strength is beautiful. Surviving is beautiful. You've done both." The compliment, so simply stated, brought tears to Margaret's eyes. She blinked them away, uncomfortable with the vulnerability. "What about you? After Sarah?" Ethan added another branch to the fire, taking his time. "Drifted for a while. Took jobs where I could find them, cattle drives, railroad work. Even did some scouting for the army. Anything to keep moving, keep from thinking too much." The scar. His hand went unconsciously to his face. "Bar fight in Tucson. Man said something about Sarah I couldn't let stand. Turned out he had friends and a knife." He shrugged. "Added to my collection. Got plenty from the war nobody sees." Margaret understood that. Scars hidden beneath clothing, beneath skin, beneath years of careful control. "Do you ever wonder if it gets easier, living with the ghosts?" "Some days I think it does. Then something happens. A woman's laugh that sounds like hers, the smell of lavender on the wind, and I'm right back there, finding her grave." He paused, then added quietly, "Though lately, the ghosts seem quieter." Their eyes met across the fire, and Margaret felt that pull again, stronger than before. These past days had stripped away pretense, leaving them both raw and honest in ways that civilization didn't allow. Out here, with death hunting them and only each other for comfort. The usual rules seemed less important. "I should check the canyon entrance," Ethan said abruptly, standing. "Make sure they've truly gone." But as he passed her, Margaret caught his hand. He stopped, looking down at her with eyes that held storms. "Stay," she whispered. "Please, I'm tired of being alone with my thoughts." He sank back down, closer this time, close enough that she could smell leather and sage, feel the warmth radiating from his body. They sat in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling upward toward the stars. "Margaret," he began, then stopped, struggling with words. "I need you to know, I'm not—" I can't offer. I'm not asking for anything, she said softly. I've had enough of men who think they own me. I just want to sit here, with you, and feel human again. He relaxed slightly, and after a moment, his arm came around her shoulders. The touch was careful, a question more than a statement. Margaret leaned into him, feeling the solid strength of his chest, the steady beat of his heart. How long since she'd been held without fear, without wondering when kindness would turn to cruelty? You're shaking, Ethan murmured. I'm not cold. I know. His arm tightened slightly. Protective. I know. They sat like that as the fire burned lower. Two damaged souls finding shelter in each other. Margaret told him about the small things, how she'd loved to read before Samuel sold her books, how she'd once dreamed of seeing the ocean. Ethan shared his own fragments, his mother's apple pie recipe, the dog he'd had as a boy, the way Kentucky grass smelled after rain. As the moon tracked across the sky, Margaret found her head on his shoulder, his fingers gently combing through her tangled hair. The intimacy was almost painful in its tenderness, so different from anything she'd known. We should sleep, Ethan said eventually, though he made no move to pull away. Long day tomorrow if we're going to try for Fort Defiance. Margaret lifted her head to look at him. In the dying firelight, his scarred face was all plains and shadows, but his eyes were soft. Without thinking, she reached up to trace the scar on his cheek. He went very still at her touch. Does it hurt? Not anymore. His voice was rough. Other things hurt worse. She understood that too. Her hand cupped his face, thumb brushing over the raised tissue. You're a good man, Ethan Cross. You don't know that. I do. She was close enough to see the war in his eyes, want battling with honor, need fighting against propriety. A bad man would have taken advantage days ago. A bad man wouldn't have risked his life for a stranger. A bad man wouldn't look at me the way you're looking at me now. How am I looking at you? Like I matter, like I'm worth saving. You are. The words came out fierce, almost angry. Goddamn anyone who made you think otherwise. The curse should have shocked her. Samuel had beaten her once for saying damn when she dropped a pot. Instead, the protective fury in Ethan's voice made her heart race. This man, who'd lost everything to cruelty and violence, was ready to fight the world for her. Ethan, she breathed, and something in her voice must have warned him because he pulled back slightly. We can't, he said roughly. You're vulnerable, scared. I won't be another man who takes advantage. You're not taking anything. Margaret interrupted. I'm not that fragile girl who married Samuel. I'm not offering myself out of gratitude or fear. I need to feel alive, to remember what it's like to choose. The moon had moved behind clouds, leaving them in near darkness, but she could feel his struggle in the tension of his body, hear it in his breathing. When he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. If we do this, it changes things. Things have already changed. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head. Their lips met in a kiss that was nothing like the brutal claiming she'd known in marriage. This was a question and answer, gentle and seeking. Margaret's hands found their way to his hair, holding him close as years of fear and loneliness cracked open inside her. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Ethan rested his forehead against hers, his hands framing her face with impossible gentleness. Margaret, he said, and her name on his lips was prayer and promise both. I know, she whispered. I know. They held each other as the fire died to embers, neither pushing for more than this moment of connection. Margaret felt the walls she'd built around her heart crumbling, letting in both terror and hope. She'd sworn never to trust again, never to let a man close enough to hurt her. But Ethan wasn't just any man. He was scarred like her, broken in different but equally profound ways. Maybe that's what made this feel less like falling and more like coming home. What happens when we reach Fort Defiance? She asked against his chest. I don't know. His honesty was another gift. No false promises, no claims of ownership. But I know I can't just ride away and leave you to face Mitchell alone. He won't give up. Then we'll keep running. He pulled back to look at her. Together, if you'll have me. I'm done letting the past dictate my future. Margaret thought of all the reasons this was foolish. They barely knew each other. She'd sworn off men forever. He was still grieving his lost love. She was fleeing a life that would follow her like a curse. But sitting here in his arms, with the desert stars as witness, none of that seemed to matter. Together, she agreed, sealing the promise with another kiss. When dawn painted the canyon walls rose and gold, they were still entwined, having dozed fitfully against each other. Belle's soft nicker woke them, and they pulled apart reluctantly, both aware that the night had shifted something fundamental between them as they prepared to leave their sanctuary. Ethan caught Margaret's hand. No regrets? She squeezed his fingers. No regrets. They emerged from the hidden canyon into a world washed clean by morning light. The tracks of Mitchell's men led away south. They'd given up the search, at least temporarily. But Margaret knew this wasn't over. Men like Mitchell didn't accept defeat easily. Still, as they set out toward Fort Defiance, Belle limping but game, Margaret felt stronger than she had in years. Not because a man was protecting her. She'd learned the hard way that protection could become possession. But because she'd chosen this, chosen him, chosen to stop running from the possibility of happiness. The sun climbed higher, promising another day of brutal heat, but Margaret welcomed it, welcomed the challenge and the journey and the uncertain future. Beside her, Ethan walked steady and sure, their hands brushing with each step, two scarred souls heading toward an unknown horizon, carrying nothing but hope and each other. Whatever waited in Fort Defiance, whatever Mitchell threw at them, they'd face it as they'd faced everything else, together, and for the first time in longer than she could remember. Margaret believed that might be enough. Fort Defiance sprawled before them like a dusty jewel in the desert. Its adobe buildings and wooden structures clustered around the old military post. The town had grown since the army abandoned it, becoming a haven for traders, drifters, and those seeking to disappear into the frontier's vast emptiness. It was exactly the kind of place where questions weren't asked, if you had money to spend. They'd arrived as the sun reached its peak, Belle's limp more pronounced after the hard journey. Ethan led them down the main street, past saloons already rowdy despite the early hour, past merchant shops displaying everything from firearms to fancy Eastern dresses. Margaret pulled her hat low, acutely aware of her bedraggled appearance and the way men's eyes followed their progress. Easy, Ethan murmured, sensing her tension. We'll get supplies and find somewhere to rest. But as they passed the Silver Dollar Saloon, trouble found them. 3 men emerged, dust-covered and mean-looking. Margaret's heart sank as she recognized one, Jake Thornton, one of Mitchell's most loyal hands. Well, well, Thornton drawled, his hand hovering near his gun. Looks like Mr. Mitchell's property decided to take a walk. Ethan shifted slightly, putting himself between Margaret and the men. The lady's not anyone's property. Move along. That's where you're wrong, friend. Thornton's smile was cold. She was bought and paid for, Mr. Mitchell don't take kindly to thieves. A crowd was gathering, the way crowds did when they smelled violence coming. Margaret saw faces in windows, men pausing their card games to watch. This was entertainment in a town starved for diversions. I wasn't sold, Margaret said, finding her voice despite her fear. You can't sell a person like cattle. Can't you? Another of Mitchell's men laughed. Her brother-in-law took the money quick enough. Makes it legal in my book. Ethan's voice was deadly quiet. In my book, any man who trades in human souls deserves what's coming to him. Now step aside. Thornton's face darkened. You threatening us, stranger? Stating facts. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Margaret saw hands moving toward weapons, saw death dancing in the dusty street. But before violence could erupt, a new voice cut through the standoff. That's enough, gentlemen. A woman emerged from the crowd, tall, severe, dressed in black from head to toe. She carried herself with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Margaret recognized the type, a successful madam, one of the few women in the frontier who wielded real power. "Miss Catherine," Thornton said, touching his hat nervously, "this ain't your concern. Everything in my town is my concern." Catherine replied coolly. Her eyes assessed Margaret with sharp intelligence. "Especially when it involves men harassing women in my streets. Bad for business. She belongs to Mr. Mitchell." "Does she now?" Catherine's smile was sharp as a blade. "Show me the legal papers." "A bill of sale recognized by the territorial government. Otherwise, you're just 3 men threatening a lady. And that's something I don't tolerate." Thornton's face flushed. "You know Mitchell don't need papers." "Then he doesn't have a claim." Catherine turned to Margaret and Ethan. "You folks looking for lodging?" Ethan nodded slowly, recognizing the political undercurrents. "We are." "Then you'll find clean rooms at the Desert Rose, 2 streets over. Tell Martha I sent you." Her gaze returned to Mitchell's men. "And you gentlemen will be leaving town. Now. Mitchell won't forget this." Thornton snarled. "I'm counting on it. Give him my regards." The men retreated, but their eyes promised this wasn't over. As the crowd dispersed, Catherine approached Margaret directly. "You've got spine, standing up to them, but spine alone won't keep Mitchell away forever." "Why help us?" Margaret asked. Catherine's expression softened fractionally. "Let's say I have a particular dislike for men who think they own women. Mitchell tried to muscle in on my business once. I sent him away missing 2 fingers." She turned to go, then paused. "Watch yourselves. This town has eyes, and not all of them are friendly." The Desert Rose boarding house was a modest but clean establishment run by a widow named Martha Brennan. She took one look at them and clucked her tongue. "Miss Catherine sent you? Then you're in some kind of trouble. Well, come on then. Hot meal and a bath first, questions later." The luxury of hot water and soap nearly made Margaret weep. She soaked in the copper tub, washing away days of dust and fear, trying not to think about how Ethan was just down the hall in his own room. The kiss in the canyon seemed like a dream now, something too tender for this harsh world of threats and violence. When she emerged, Martha had laid out a simple but clean dress. "Belonged to my daughter," the woman said gruffly. "She won't be needing it where she's gone." Margaret didn't ask if the daughter was dead or merely departed. On the frontier, both amounted to the same thing. The dress fit reasonably well, though it pulled tight across her chest and hips. Still, it was clean and whole, and that was luxury enough. She found Ethan in the boarding house's small dining room, cleaned up and wearing a fresh shirt. His face lit up when he saw her, then quickly shuddered. They were back in civilization now, such as it was, and the rules were different than in the desert's isolation. "You look," he cleared his throat, "better, rested. Martha says there's a stage that comes through weekly, heading north to Colorado," Margaret said, taking a seat across from him. "It's due in 3 days?" "That's good. We can—" He stopped, frowning. "You said there's, not there's one we can take." Margaret looked down at her hands. "Your business here, your brother, can wait." "No." She met his eyes. "You've done enough, risked enough. I won't have you abandoning your family obligations for me. Margaret, please." She reached across the table, briefly touching his hand before propriety made her pull back. "Find your brother. Make whatever peace you can. I'll be fine." His jaw tightened. "With Mitchell's men watching every road out of town? You heard Thornton. They know you're here." As if to underscore his words, Martha appeared with their food and a warning. 3 more of Mitchell's boys just rode in. They're making camp outside town, watching the roads." She set down plates of stew and cornbread. "Whatever you're planning, best think it through careful." They ate in tense silence, the weight of their situation pressing down. Margaret had thought reaching Fort Defiance would mean safety, but it was just a larger trap. Mitchell's reach was longer than she'd imagined. That evening, Ethan insisted on walking her to her room. In the narrow hallway, away from prying eyes, he caught her arm gently. "Don't ask me to leave you here alone," he said, "not with them circling like vultures. And don't ask me to be the reason you lose your last chance with family," she countered. "You said he might be here. You need to know." He studied her face in the lamplight. "You're the stubbornest woman I've ever met. I learned from necessity." His hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb brushing over her cheekbone. "What happened in the canyon was real," Margaret finished. "But this is real too, the danger I've brought to your life. You think I care about danger?" His voice turned fierce. "You think I wouldn't face down 100 Mitchells for—" He stopped, struggling with words. "For what?" she whispered. Instead of answering, he kissed her, not gentle like before, but desperate, as if trying to convince her with touch what words couldn't convey. Margaret melted into him, her hands gripping his shirt, letting herself feel for just this moment, when they broke apart, both breathing hard. Ethan rested his forehead against hers. 2 days, he said. "Give me 2 days to find James. Then we leave together." "Ethan." 2 days. Margaret, promise me." She saw the fear in his eyes, fear of losing someone else to violence and greed. How could she deny him? 2 days. The next morning brought new tensions. Mitchell's men had made their presence known throughout town, asking questions, spreading money around for information. Margaret kept to her room, watching from the window as Ethan searched for news of his brother. Martha brought her meals and gossip in equal measure. "That man of yours is turning the town upside down looking for someone. Must be important." "He's not my man," Margaret said automatically. Martha snorted. "Could have fooled me. The way he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching, that's a man with claims on his heart, whether he's said so or not." That afternoon, a soft knock came at her door. Margaret tensed, but it was only Catherine, the woman who'd intervened yesterday. "Thought you might like some company," she said, though her sharp eyes suggested this was more than a social call. They sat by the window, sharing tea that Martha brought. Catherine studied Margaret with uncomfortable intensity. "You're not what I expected," she finally said. "Mitchell usually goes for the frail ones, the ones who break easy. Maybe that's why I ran. Maybe." Catherine sipped her tea thoughtfully. "I've had girls work for me who came from situations like yours, sold by family, trapped by circumstances. Some of them found their strength in my house. Others—" She shrugged. "Others just found a different kind of cage." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you've got a choice to make." "That man of yours? Yes, I know. He's not your man. He's got the look of someone who'd burn the world for you. Question is, what are you willing to do for him?" Margaret frowned. "I don't understand. Mitchell's not going to stop. Even if you make it to Colorado, he'll follow. His pride's involved now. But there are ways to make men like him lose interest. Legal ways, if you're smart about it." "What are you suggesting?" Catherine smiled. "I'm suggesting that sometimes the best cage is one you choose yourself. Marriage, for instance. A married woman has protections a widow doesn't, especially if her husband's the type to defend what's his." Heat flooded Margaret's face. "Ethan and I aren't. We haven't." "Haven't you?" Catherine stood, smoothing her skirts. "Think about it. Judge Harris performs ceremonies every Saturday. Very reasonable rates." After she left, Margaret sat stunned. Marriage, the word itself made her stomach clench with remembered fear. But marriage to Ethan? The thought was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. That evening, Ethan returned with grim news. Found someone who knew James. He was here 6 months ago, working at the copper mine. But there was an accident, a cave-in. They buried 12 men in the local cemetery. Margaret's heart ached for him. "I'm so sorry." He nodded, accepting comfort but clearly struggling with the confirmation of his last family gone. They sat together in the dining room, neither hungry but going through the motions of eating. "I'll visit the grave tomorrow," he said quietly. "Say my goodbyes. Then we leave." "Ethan, about leaving." Margaret gathered her courage. Catherine came to see me today. She had a suggestion, she explained, watching emotions play across his face. Surprise, hope, fear, and something deeper she couldn't quite name. Marriage, he repeated slowly. To protect you from Mitchell's claims. It was just a thought. I know it's too much to ask. Is it? He leaned forward intently. Is it really too much? Margaret? Their eyes met and held. In that gaze was everything they hadn't said. The growing feelings, the shared pain, the possibility of a future neither had dared imagine. It wouldn't be real, Margaret said weakly. Just a legal formality. Wouldn't it? His voice was rough. Tell me you don't feel this thing between us. Tell me that kiss meant nothing. She couldn't. The words stuck in her throat because they would be lies. And she was done with lies. I'm broken, she whispered instead. You deserve better than a woman who flinches at shadows, who carries another man's bruises on her soul. And I'm a man who couldn't save the woman he loved, who carries ghosts wherever he goes. He reached across the table, taking her hands. Maybe that makes us perfect for each other. Maybe broken people can build something whole together. Margaret felt tears slip down her cheeks. I'm scared. So am I. His thumbs brushed over her knuckles. But I'm more scared of losing you. The moment hung between them, fragile and precious. Then the door burst open and one of Martha's serving girls ran in, face pale. Mitchell's here, she gasped. He just rode in with 20 men. They're heading this way. The storm came from nowhere, as desert storms often did. One moment the evening sky was clear, scattered with the first stars, and the next, black clouds rolled in like an invading army. Lightning split the sky, followed by thunder that shook the boarding house windows. Then the rain came, not the gentle precipitation of eastern states, but a violent deluge that turned streets to rivers within minutes. Margaret and Ethan had fled when word came of Mitchell's arrival, slipping out the back of the Desert Rose as his men entered the front. Now they huddled in an abandoned miner's cabin on the outskirts of town, listening to the rain hammer the tin roof like gunfire. We can't stay here long, Ethan said, checking his revolver for the third time. Water dripped through gaps in the roof, creating muddy puddles on the dirt floor. Once this storm passes, they'll search every building outside town. Margaret wrung water from her skirts, shivering in her soaked dress. The cabin was barely more than 4 walls and a roof. No furniture, no stove. Just empty space that smelled of dust and abandonment. But it was shelter, and right now, that was everything. Martha said there's a freight wagon leaving at dawn, Margaret said through chattering teeth. Heading to the railroad camp. We could hide in the back. Too risky. Mitchell will have men watching every route out. Ethan shrugged out of his coat, wrapping it around her shoulders despite her protests. We need another plan. Lightning illuminated the cabin's interior in stark flashes, throwing their shadows against the walls like dancing ghosts. In those brief moments of brilliance, Margaret could see the tension in Ethan's jaw, the worry he was trying to hide. They'd come so far, survived so much, only to be trapped like rabbits in a snare. Maybe I should just face him, she said quietly. End this before anyone gets hurt. Ethan turned on her so fast she stepped back. Don't. His voice was raw with emotion. Don't even think it. He won't stop. Ethan, you heard Catherine. His pride is involved now. How many people will suffer because I dared to run? He crossed to her in 2 strides, gripping her shoulders gently but firmly. You're not going back to him. Not while I'm breathing. And what happens when you stop breathing? Tears mixed with rainwater on her cheeks. What happens when Mitchell's men put a bullet in you because of me? Then I'll die free, he said fiercely. Die fighting for something worth fighting for. First time since Sarah... His voice cracked. First time since I lost her that I felt truly alive. You did that. You made me remember why life's worth living. The rain intensified, drumming so loudly they had to move closer to hear each other. Margaret found herself pressed against Ethan's chest, his arms around her, sharing what warmth they could generate between them. I'm not worth dying for, she whispered against his shirt. Let me be the judge of that. His hand stroked her wet hair, gentle despite the calluses. Besides, who says anyone's dying? We've made it this far. They stood like that for long minutes, holding each other while the storm raged outside. Margaret felt the steady beat of his heart against her cheek, the rise and fall of his breathing. How strange that she felt safer here, in this decrepit cabin with danger closing in, than she'd ever felt in her marriage bed. A particularly violent crack of thunder made them both jump. In the aftermath, another sound reached them. Horses, moving fast despite the storm. Ethan immediately pushed Margaret behind him, hand going to his gun. But the horses passed by without stopping, their riders apparently seeking better shelter. The reprieve was temporary, though, come dawn, the search would begin in earnest. Tell me about the ocean, Ethan said suddenly. Margaret blinked at the non sequitur. What? You said you dreamed of seeing it. Tell me about that dream. She understood then. He was trying to distract her, to push back the fear with words and wishes. I used to read about it in books. How it goes on forever, blue meeting blue where water touches sky. They say you can taste salt in the air, hear the waves even when you're sleeping. Pacific's not that far from Colorado, he said thoughtfully. Could make it in a few weeks if we pushed hard. We? You think I'm letting you see your first ocean alone? There was a smile in his voice despite everything. Someone needs to make sure you don't walk straight in, hypnotized by all that blue. Margaret laughed, actually laughed, despite their circumstances. I can swim. In a Missouri pond, maybe. Ocean's different. Waves tall as houses. Currents that'll pull you out to sea. His arms tightened around her. No, you'll need someone with you. Someone who cares if you come back to shore. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Margaret turned in his arms, looking up at his face in the darkness. Lightning flashed again, showing her the intensity in his eyes, the way he looked at her like she was something precious. Ethan, she breathed, and then his mouth was on hers. This kiss was different from the others, desperate and hungry, full of the knowledge that tomorrow might never come. Margaret's hands tangled in his wet hair, pulling him closer, needing to feel alive in the face of so much threat. He responded with equal fervor, backing her against the cabin wall, his body sheltering hers from the leaking roof. Margaret, he groaned against her lips. We shouldn't, please, she whispered. I need to feel something besides fear. I need to know what it's like to choose, really choose, before... Don't say it. He kissed her again, softer this time. Nothing's ending tomorrow. But they both knew he couldn't promise that. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one waiting for them in town. Still, in this moment, with the rain pounding the roof and lightning turning the world silver white, they had each other. Ethan's hands were gentle as they framed her face, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. You're sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. What followed was unlike anything in Margaret's experience. Where Samuel had taken, Ethan gave. Where there had been pain and domination, now there was tenderness and mutual need. They made a bed of their wet coats on the cabin floor, the storm providing a strange symphony to their joining. Margaret discovered that intimacy could be a conversation without words, a sharing of souls as much as bodies. Every touch was a promise, every kiss a declaration of things they couldn't yet say aloud. When Ethan whispered her name like a prayer, when he held her like she might disappear, Margaret felt something broken inside her begin to heal. Afterward, they lay entwined on their makeshift bed, listening to the rain begin to slacken. Ethan's hand traced lazy patterns on her back, and Margaret felt a contentment she'd never known existed. No regrets, he asked, echoing his question from the canyon. None, she said firmly. Whatever happens tomorrow will be better because of tonight. He pressed a kiss to her temple. Because now I've got even more reason to keep us both alive. Margaret propped herself up on an elbow, studying his face. You really think we can make it? Past Mitchell? Past all of this? I think we've already made it past worse. You survived a marriage that tried to break you. I survived a war and losing everything I loved. We found each other in the middle of nowhere, two broken souls who fit together somehow. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. If that's not a miracle, I don't know what is. When you put it like that. Margaret managed a smile. Though I notice you didn't mention your terrible sense of direction. We could have been in Colorado by now if you hadn't insisted on that shortcut through Devil's Canyon. That shortcut saved us from Mitchell's men, he protested. After leading us straight to them in the first place. Woman, you are never going to let me forget that. Are you? Never, she confirmed, then kissed him to soften the teasing. They talked quietly as the storm moved on, making plans they both knew might never come to pass. Ethan spoke of a little ranch he'd seen once in California, near enough to the ocean to smell salt on the wind. Margaret described the gardens she'd plant, the books she'd read in the evenings, the peaceful life they'd build together. Neither mentioned the armed men waiting in town or the vengeful rancher who considered Margaret his property. For these few hours, they existed outside of fear and threat, just two people discovering that love could bloom even in the harshest ground. As dawn approached, turning the sky from black to gray, they dressed in their still damp clothes and prepared to face whatever came next. But something had changed between them, something fundamental and unbreakable. Margaret, Ethan said as they stood at the cabin door, preparing to leave their sanctuary. What Catherine suggested about marriage. We don't have to discuss. Yes, we do. He turned her to face him. Not because of Mitchell or legal protection or any of that, but because I want to. Because somewhere between finding you half dead in the desert and holding you through this storm, I went and fell in love with you. Margaret's breath caught. Ethan, I know it's fast. I know we've both got ghosts. But I also know that when I think about facing tomorrow, the only thing that matters is facing it with you. He reached into his pocket, pulling out something small. Found this yesterday when I was looking for information about James. It was a ring, simple silver with a small turquoise stone. Nothing fancy. Nothing like the ostentatious band Samuel had forced onto her finger, but it was perfect. It's not much, Ethan said uncertainly. But if you'll have me, yes. Margaret interrupted, surprising them both with the quickness of her answer. Yes, Ethan Cross. I'll marry you. Today, if Judge Harris is willing. Before Mitchell can... She stopped, shaking her head. No, not because of Mitchell. Because I love you too. Because you see me, really see me, and somehow still think I'm worth fighting for. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit as if made for her. You're worth everything, he said simply. They kissed there in the doorway of the abandoned cabin, with dawn breaking over the desert and danger waiting in the town below. It was a kiss full of promise and determination, a seal on the future they'd build together or die trying to protect. As they stepped out into the clean-washed morning, Margaret felt the weight of the simple ring on her finger and the stronger weight of Ethan's love surrounding her like armor. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to see them through to that California ranch and the ocean beyond. The sun rose fully, burning away the storm clouds and revealing a world made new by rain. Somewhere ahead, Mitchell waited with his men and his wounded pride, but Margaret Sullivan, soon to be Margaret Cross, was no longer running in fear. She was walking toward her future, hand in hand with a man who'd taught her that love could be gentle, that strength came in many forms, and that sometimes the best shelter from life's storms was found in another's arms. The attack came at sunset, painting violence in shades of red and gold across the desert floor. Margaret and Ethan had made it back to town after the storm, finding temporary refuge with Catherine while they waited for Judge Harris to return from his circuit. But Mitchell had grown tired of waiting. They were in the small chapel at the edge of town. Ethan had wanted to visit before the ceremony, saying a prayer at the simple altar. Margaret waited in the back pew, her new ring catching the light through stained glass windows. For a moment, Everything was peaceful. Then the doors burst open. There she is! Thornton led the charge, 5 men behind him, all armed and mean-looking. Thought you could hide behind church walls. Ethan moved faster than thought, pushing Margaret behind the heavy wooden pew as gunfire erupted. Splinters flew as bullets struck wood and adobe. The windows exploded in rainbow fragments, showering them with colored glass. "Stay down!" Ethan shouted, returning fire. He'd always been fast with a gun, but he was outnumbered 6 to 1. Margaret pressed herself to the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was her fault, all of it. These men were here because of her. Ethan was in danger because of her. The guilt was crushing. But beneath it, something else stirred. Anger. Pure, righteous fury at men who thought they could own her, hunt her, destroy anyone who helped her. A cry of pain. Ethan's voice. Margaret's head snapped up to see him clutching his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. He was still firing, but his aim was off, his movements growing sluggish. "Just give us the woman, friend." Thornton called out, "No need for you to die over used goods." That did it. Margaret's vision went red. She spotted Ethan's spare revolver where it had fallen from his holster, grabbed it without thinking. The weight was familiar. Samuel had made her clean his guns often enough. "Margaret, no!" Ethan gasped. But she was already moving. Years of dodging Samuel's fists had taught her to be quick, to be unpredictable. She rolled out from behind the pew, firing as she moved. Her first shot went wide, but the second caught one of Mitchell's men in the leg. He went down screaming. "The woman's got teeth!" someone shouted. Gunfire intensified. Margaret dove behind the altar as wood splintered around her. From her new position, she could see Ethan trying to reload one-handed, his shoulder wound bleeding freely. Their eyes met across the chaos, and in his gaze, she saw pride mixed with fear. Then Mitchell himself appeared in the doorway. Josiah Mitchell was a big man, prosperous and cruel, with the kind of face that had never been denied anything it wanted. He surveyed the damage to his men with cold fury before his eyes found Margaret. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his voice cutting through the gunfire. "This has gone on long enough. You've cost me time, money, and now men. Come quietly, and I might let your friend here live." "Go to hell," Margaret spat. Mitchell's face darkened. "I paid good money for you. Your brother-in-law's debts are settled because of me. I belong to no one." The words ripped from her throat. Years of suppressed rage finally finding voice. "Not to you, not to my dead husband, not to anyone who thinks they can buy and sell me like cattle." She fired at Mitchell, the bullet striking the doorframe inches from his head. He dove aside, cursing. "Take them both!" he roared. "Dead or alive, I don't care anymore." What followed was chaos. Ethan, despite his wound, fought like a man possessed. Margaret had never seen anything like it. The gentle man who'd held her through the storm transformed into a warrior. Deadly and precise, but there were too many of them. Just when it seemed hopeless. New gunfire erupted from outside. Catherine burst through the side door, a shotgun in her hands and murder in her eyes. Behind her came several of her girls, all armed, all fierce. "Nobody shoots up my town without consequences," Catherine declared. Unloading both barrels into the cluster of Mitchell's men, the tide turned. Faced with unexpected reinforcements, Mitchell's hired guns began to fall back. 2 were down, wounded. Another had fled entirely. But Thornton remained, loyal to the last, and Mitchell himself seemed beyond reason. "You meddling witch!" Mitchell snarled at Catherine. "This isn't your business." "I made it my business when you brought violence to my doorstep." Catherine reloaded with practiced ease. "Fort Defiance might be lawless, but it's my kind of lawless. We don't cotton to men who can't take no for an answer." The standoff stretched taut. Margaret could see Ethan swaying on his feet, losing too much blood. She needed to get him help, but they were pinned down. Then she noticed something, a lamp hanging near Mitchell, oil-filled and forgotten. One shot. The lamp exploded, fire blooming across the wooden doorframe. Mitchell leaped back with a cry, and in that moment of distraction, Margaret moved. She ran to Ethan, catching him as his knees buckled. "Got you," she whispered, taking his weight. Blood soaked her dress, warm and terrifying. "I've got you. Behind you!" Catherine shouted. Margaret turned to see Thornton, his gun aimed at her head. Time slowed. She saw death in his eyes, knew she couldn't move fast enough. This was it, after everything. It would end here, in a chapel with broken windows and blood on sacred ground. The shot rang out, but it was Thornton who fell, a red bloom spreading across his chest. Behind him stood the last person Margaret expected, Jake, the ranch hand who'd helped her escape that first night. "Told you Mitchell was a devil," Jake said quietly, lowering his smoking gun. "Came to town to warn you he was coming, but looks like I'm late to the party." Mitchell stood alone now, his men dead or fled, flames licking at the chapel walls behind him, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. "You'll hang for this," he snarled. "All of you. I've got influence, connections. You think some frontier whores and a half-dead drifter can stand against me?" "No," said a new voice from the doorway. "But the law can." Judge Harris entered, flanked by 2 federal marshals. The elderly judge looked disapprovingly at the carnage, then fixed his stern gaze on Mitchell. "Josiah Mitchell, you're under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy, and violating the territory's anti-slavery statutes." The judge's voice was dry as desert wind. "Seems trying to buy a woman-like property is illegal in these parts. Has been for near 20 years now. You can't. She was payment for debt. I have rights. You have the right to a trial." One of the marshals interrupted, producing shackles. "Though given what we just witnessed, I wouldn't count on mercy," as they dragged Mitchell away, still screaming about his money and his rights. Margaret felt the strength leave her legs. She sank to the floor, Ethan's head in her lap, pressing her hands against his wound. "Stay with me," she begged. "Don't you dare die on me now. Ethan Cross, not when we're so close." His eyes fluttered open, focusing on her face. "Not going anywhere," he managed. "Still got an ocean to show you." Catherine was already shouting orders, sending her girls for the doctor, for bandages, for anything that might help. Jake knelt beside them, his young face grave. "He's strong," he told Margaret. "Seen men survive worse." But Margaret could feel Ethan's life pulsing out between her fingers, could see the pallor creeping across his face. She bent over him, her tears falling on his cheeks. "You saved me," she whispered. "From the desert, from Mitchell, from myself. Let me save you now. Fight, Ethan, please fight." The doctor arrived in a rush of competent hands and sharp instruments. They moved Ethan to Catherine's establishment, the closest thing to a hospital Fort Defiance possessed. Margaret refused to leave his side, holding his hand as the doctor worked to remove the bullet and stop the bleeding. Hours passed in a haze of laudanum fumes and whispered prayers. Catherine's girls brought Margaret water and clean clothes, but she wouldn't move. Jake stationed himself at the door, a self-appointed guardian. The federal marshals took statements, pieced together the trail of violence that had led to this moment. "He'll live," the doctor finally pronounced, wiping bloody hands on a towel. "The bullet missed anything vital. He's lost blood, but he's strong. With the rest and care, he should recover fully." Margaret sobbed with relief, pressing kisses to Ethan's unconscious face. Around her, the others dispersed, Catherine to see about the damaged chapel, Jake to the saloon for a well-earned drink, the doctor to his other patients. But Margaret remained, keeping vigil over the man who'd become her whole world in a handful of desperate days. As dawn broke through the windows, Ethan's eyes opened. They were clearer now, focused, alive. "Hey," he whispered. "Hey yourself." Margaret smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "You scared me. Sorry, didn't mean to get shot on our wedding day." She laughed through fresh tears. "We never did make it to Judge Harris. He's probably busy with Mitchell anyway." His hand found hers, squeezing weakly. "Margaret, what you did in the chapel. You were magnificent. I was terrified. Most courage comes from terror. You faced down 6 men and Mitchell himself. Saved my life. You saved mine first, several times over. Then we're even." He managed a smile. "Good foundation for a marriage, mutual life-saving." Judge Harris appeared in the doorway, looking tired but pleased. "Mitchell's locked up tight. He'll be transported to Tucson for trial. Given the evidence and witness testimony, he'll likely spend the next decade breaking rocks in territorial prison." "It's over." Margaret could barely believe it. "Really over?" "Really over," the judge confirmed. "Though I hear there was supposed to be a wedding. Seems a shame to waste everyone's time." And so, in a room that smelled of laudanum and gunpowder, with the morning sun streaming through lace curtains, Margaret Sullivan became Margaret Cross. Catherine stood as witness. Jake as best man. Ethan remained in bed, too weak to stand, but his voice was strong as he spoke his vows. "I promise to love you in desert and rain," he said, eyes never leaving hers. "To stand beside you against any storm, to show you oceans and give you gardens, to be your shelter when you need one and your freedom when you don't, till death do us part." Margaret's vows came from her heart, unplanned and true. "I promise to choose you every day, to trust in your gentleness and share in your strength, to build a life with you based on love, not fear, to be your partner in all things, till death do us part." Judge Harris pronounced them married, and their kiss tasted of tears and joy and the metallic tang of blood, a fitting beginning for 2 people who'd found love in violence's shadow. Later, as Ethan slept and Margaret kept watch, she thought about the journey that had brought them here, from that desperate flight into the desert to this quiet room. Every step had led toward this moment. She touched the ring on her finger, then the matching band they'd placed on Ethan's hand. They'd won more than their lives in that chapel. They'd won the right to a future together, free from the chains of the past. Mitchell would rot in prison. The desert had tested them and found them worthy. And somewhere to the west, an ocean waited, patient and eternal, for 2 scarred souls to stand on its shore and finally, truly, be free. The morning sun painted the grasslands in shades of gold and amber, a far cry from the harsh reds of the desert they'd left behind 6 months ago. Margaret stood on the hill overlooking their small ranch, watching the horses graze in the valley below. The Pacific breeze carried salt and promise, just as Ethan had said it would. "Coffee's ready." His voice came from behind her, warm with the contentment that had replaced his old shadows. She turned to see him approaching, no longer favoring his wounded shoulder, though she knew it still ached on cold mornings. In his hands were 2 steaming cups, and his eyes held that soft look he reserved just for her. "You were up early," he said, handing her a cup. "Couldn't sleep. Too excited about today." Margaret smiled, leaning into his side as he wrapped an arm around her. "Our first real harvest. Who would have thought that desert flower would become a farmer's wife?" "You're more than that," Ethan murmured against her hair. "You're a rancher, a horse trainer, and according to Mrs. Patterson in town, the best pie maker in 3 counties. Margaret laughed. "She's being kind. My crust still needs work. Everything you make is perfect to me." They stood in comfortable silence, watching their land wake up. It wasn't the grand ranch Ethan had once described, just 40 acres with a small house, a barn, and dreams as big as the sky. But it was theirs, bought with honest work and sweat, not blood or fear. Belle grazed nearby, her coat glossy with health. The mare had recovered fully from her injury, though she'd never be quite as fast. She'd earned her retirement, serving now as a gentle mount for Margaret's rides to town and back. They'd added 2 more horses to their small herd, with plans for more come spring. "Letter came yesterday," Ethan said carefully. "From Jake." Margaret tensed slightly. Letters from their past were rare and often carried complicated feelings. "What did he say?" "Thomas Sullivan died, drank himself to death. Apparently, The ranch is being sold for debts. Ethan paused, studying her face. Jake wanted to know if you wanted any of your mother's things. Said he saved what he could. Margaret considered this. Thomas, who'd tried to sell her like livestock, was dead. She waited for some feeling. Satisfaction, maybe, or closure, but there was only a distant sadness for the waste of it all. "Tell him thank you," she said finally. "And to send what he has, Mama's Bible, especially if it survived." "I'll write him today." Ethan pressed a kiss to her temple. "You all right?" "Yes." And she meant it. "That life feels like it belonged to someone else. Someone I used to know but can't quite remember anymore." They walked down to the house together, a simple structure they'd built with help from their neighbors. The kitchen still smelled of last night's bread, and sunlight streamed through windows Margaret had insisted on, lots of windows, to banish any shadows that might try to creep in. As Margaret prepared breakfast, Ethan talked about the day's plans. They'd need to bring in the rest of the corn, repair a section of fence the wild pigs had damaged, check on their small vegetable garden. Simple tasks, but Margaret treasured each one. This was what life was supposed to be, building something together, day by day, season by season. "Oh," Ethan said suddenly, a grin spreading across his face. "I nearly forgot. Close your eyes. What are you up to?" "Trust me." She did, completely. With her eyes closed, she heard him moving around, then felt him take her hand and lead her outside. "All right, open them." Margaret gasped. There in front of the house was a small garden plot he must have worked on in secret, already planted with rose bushes and lavender, with a bench positioned to catch the morning sun. But what made her eyes fill with tears was the wooden sign he'd carved. "Margaret's Garden, where love grows." "Ethan," she breathed, turning to throw her arms around his neck. "It's perfect." "You said you wanted a garden by the ocean," he murmured, holding her tight. "Took me a while to make it happen, but I keep my promises." "Yes, you do." She kissed him deeply, pouring all her love and gratitude into the connection. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. The familiar fire kindled between them. "We have work to do," Margaret said weakly. "Work can wait an hour." Ethan decided, sweeping her up in his arms and carrying her back inside, her laughter floating on the salt breeze. Later, as they worked side by side in the cornfield, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought them here. Sometimes she still woke in the night, heart racing, expecting to find herself back in that desperate flight across the desert. But then Ethan's arm would tighten around her, his voice murmuring comfort, and the fear would fade. They'd had word that Mitchell had indeed been sentenced to 10 years hard labor, Catherine had written once, reporting that Fort Defiance had settled back into its usual controlled chaos. Judge Harris had sent them a wedding gift, a proper certificate to replace the hasty one he'd scrawled in the aftermath of violence. But mostly, they'd left that world behind. Out here, they were just another young couple trying to make a life on the frontier. Their neighbors knew some of their story. Hard to hide Ethan's scar or the way Margaret sometimes flinched at unexpected sounds. But frontier folk understood that everyone carried history, and what mattered was who you chose to be going forward. As the sun climbed higher, they took a break in the shade of an old oak. Margaret had packed a simple lunch, bread, cheese, early apples from their single tree. They ate in companionable silence, shoulders touching, watching clouds drift across the endless sky. "No regrets?" Ethan asked, their old question that had become a private joke. "Only one," Margaret said seriously. He turned to her in concern, but she was smiling. "I regret it took so long to find you. Think of all the years we could have had." "We have them now," he reminded her. "All the years ahead." "Yes," she agreed. "We do." As afternoon approached, they returned to work. Margaret found herself humming, something she'd started doing again only recently. The music that Samuel had beaten out of her had slowly returned, like water seeping back into drought-dry earth. When the day's work was done, They walked down to the cliff edge where their property met the sea. This was their evening ritual. Watching the sun set over the Pacific, the ocean stretched endlessly before them. Just as Margaret had dreamed, some days calm and blue, others wild with storms, but always there, constant and free. "I used to think freedom meant being alone," Margaret said, the wind whipping her hair around her face. "Never depending on anyone, never being vulnerable. What do you think now?" She took his hand, their wedding rings catching the dying light. "Now I think real freedom is choosing who to trust with your heart. It's being vulnerable with someone who'll never use it against you." Ethan pulled her close, and they stood together as the sun painted the sky in impossible colors. Behind them was their home, their land, their life built on mutual respect and love. Ahead was the ocean, vast with possibility. "I love you, Margaret Cross," Ethan said, as he did every evening at this time. "And I love you, Ethan Cross," she replied, completing their ritual. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they turned back toward home. There would be dinner to prepare, animals to tend, plans to make for tomorrow. But for now, they walked hand in hand across their land. Two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and discovered that sometimes the greatest adventure wasn't crossing the desert. It was building a life with someone who saw your scars and called them beautiful. The ocean wind followed them home, carrying the scent of salt and new beginnings. And Margaret smiled, knowing that every sunrise would bring another day of the life she'd once thought impossible. A life chosen freely, lived fully, and shared with a man who'd taught her that love could be as gentle as morning rain and as steady as the earth beneath their feet. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, but the sound no longer brought fear. It was just another voice in the vast chorus of the frontier, where broken hearts learned to heal and second chances bloomed like wildflowers after rain. They were home. Thank you all for listening to this Wild West love story. I'd love to hear where you're enjoying this tale, whether you're listening during your commute, relaxing at home, or perhaps on your own journey. Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Margaret and Ethan's story in the comments below. What part touched your heart the most? Let's connect and share our love for these frontier romances together.